The idea of using tools to make less expert people able to do more expert things would be a really, if we can pull it off, would be a very powerful use of this technology.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
Over the last 4 decades, one of the biggest issues and challenges to capitalism has been growing inequality. You can't have a healthy economy or healthy society with terrible and rising inequality. We already knew this was a problem, and when the pandemic hit, the experts said it was going to get worse. How could it not get worse? Low-wage jobs disappeared because industries like hospitality and restaurants were disproportionately affected by the shutdowns. Clearly, this was a disaster for inequality.
But this is not what happened. All the experts were totally wrong. By early 2022, the employment-to-population ratio among adults with only a high school education had already attained 100% of its early 2020 level, which, by the way, was already a very high level historically. So people with only a high school education recover all their jobs by the beginning of 2022. And this is one of the factoids that emerged in a recent paper by David Autor. In his paper, he writes, rapid relative wage growth at the bottom of the distribution reduced the college wage premium and counteracted approximately 1/4 of the 4-decade increase in the aggregate 9 to 10 log wage inequality. So translated into English means that the change in the differential between what the people in the 90% of the income distribution makes and what people in the 10th percent of the income distribution make has increased disproportionately in the last 40 years. Now, 1/4 of that increase has been made up just in the last 2 years.
It's a pretty stunning statistic. And yes, inflation has risen so fast that the fall in inequality has not meant actually earnings growth for almost anyone. But Autor and his colleagues found that young high school workers constitute the only group that has not seen its post-pandemic earnings gains entirely eroded by inflation. This is a big deal. But what happened? Why? And what does it mean for the future?
This seems to me the definition of socialism, that we become equally miserable, and that you should rejoice at the fact that we're equally miserable. Jokes aside, David Autor is regarded as one of the foremost experts on employment and technological change. He is an economist, public policy scholar, and professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he also acts as a co-director of the School Effectiveness and Inequality Initiative. And he's joining us on the podcast to discuss his paper and much, much more.
Before we bring David in, Luigi, let me ask you a few questions. What makes this research, this new paper he did, so groundbreaking? Is it the conclusion that inequality, strangely enough, in the aftermath of the pandemic has actually narrowed? Or is there something also about the way in which he did the research that is different?
First of all, I think that I would like to spend a little bit of time describing his overall research because it's very important. First of all, he really nailed what we now call the China shock. I nailed how important the fast liberalization of trade with China was in impacting employment in the United States, but particularly employment in Midwest regions that were affected very negatively. He's basically the father of the China shock literature. And also, he's the one that studied a lot the displacement effect that technology has on work, but also the creation of new jobs that come with technology.
So just a couple of technical things before we move on to actually talking to David. In his paper, he talks about this notion of imperfect labor market competition. What does that mean, and how is that different than how most economists think about the labor market?
So it's actually stunning. I'm not a labor economist, but I read a lot of this literature recently, and even the top labor economists say, until recently, we thought that there weren't a lot of frictions in the labor market. More or less, people were paid their competitive wage. Now, people are realizing that there are a lot of friction, some of them have to do with mobility. Some of that is with segmentation of information. Some of that may be even with dual career issues, etc. But many employers succeed in holding on to people paying less than, quote unquote, their market wage. That's what having some market power means. And this is more diffuse than we make it to be. If you remember, when we interviewed Eric Posner about his book, all his book was about the fact that even the antitrust authorities were not looking for exercise of market power in the labor market because it was thought to be so weak. And now I think people have changed their mind and they look much more carefully. Surprise, surprise, when they look, they actually do find something.
So with no further ado, let's bring in David and talk about his work, and then you and I can circle back and discuss what we think.
So, David, you're one of the few economists I know that has been fired from a real job, right? And probably the only one I know, and for sure the only one I know, that was fired because was wearing nail polish. So, to what extent your experience in the real world changed your way you are a labor economist?
So I started as a student at Columbia. I dropped out after 3 semesters. I was a very unhappy kid. I mean, I was not suitable for employment. And so I was just up to something nutty every weekend. And one day I came in and I had decided, it wouldn't be fun to wear nail polish this week. And I was doing microelectronic assembly, meaning I was putting together integrated circuits with my hands, and my boss came in and saw me handling the integrated circuits with nail polish. And that was not okay. That was the end of that job. But I had a number of jobs, and one of those jobs was I spent several years as an educational director at a nonprofit in San Francisco, working at a Black Methodist church, where we did computer skills training for poor kids and adults. And this was back in the late 1980s, and we were funded by Apple and a lot of the other Silicon Valley companies. And there was a sense of this digital divide. We didn't know what that meant, and I don't think we knew if we were effective, but we believed strongly that the tools required for work were changing, and many people who were going to need those tools didn't have access to them. So I think that work, the combination of that work and my own work, I also worked at McDonald's. I also worked as a temp. I also worked at a pizza place for a long time. I also did software development. That's how I got so old. Made me very cognizant of the way the kind of winds of change in the labor market affect the livelihoods of lots of people. And this is why, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about technology, also trade, also temporary help agencies, things that impinge on the quality of jobs and often move things around really quickly.
You've talked about reimagining capitalism in order to save it. How important is getting the nitty-gritty of labor markets right to saving capitalism?
Oh, I think you can't save capitalism without it. I mean, nitty-gritty is, I would call it, this is the biggest in the big picture, right? And I think Danny Roderick has put this very well. He says you can think about sort of 3 ways you can sort of intervene in income distribution. One way is through what you would call pre-market activities, like educating people, training people, investing in people. The other is post-market, where you tax and transfer. And then there's the direct within the market, where you actually affect the quality of jobs. And this is the one we tend to do the least, and understandably, right? It's a difficult place to work. But in some sense, I think it's the most important. I think nobody likes taxation and transferring, right? Neither the people who pay the taxes nor the people who receive the benefits. We have an interest in making sure that work works for most people. And the reason is, 60% of GDP goes to labor, and that's our primary means of income distribution. And if we didn't have that system, if money came out of a hole in the ground, right, and then we all had to redistribute it, right, it would be a war of all against all. Or let's say it came out of a hole in one person's lawn, and then we had to tax it and redistribute it, right? It would be a terrible, terrible problem. So work, as an method of income distribution, as a means of structuring society, of promoting, social goods, things that are useful and productive and give people esteem and meaning and structure and all kinds of things. It has so many benefits. I don't know of a good alternative to it. And when labor markets work well, a lot of other social problems decline a bit, right? So crime tends to decline, families tend to work a bit better. I think we should take a moment to actually be kind of happy about the situation we're in the sense that I think many of us thought coming out of the pandemic that we would be in a state of depressed labor markets where all the gains that we were making were going to be undone. Instead, we're in a period where inequality by many measures is coming down, and more importantly, the quality of work for people who are low paid is improving. And some of this does, we should credit our effective policy, not perfect policy, but effective policy for helping us guide ourselves out of the pandemic. And we often talk about how government can't do anything. But in fact, turns out government could just spend 10% of GDP to, assist households, to assist businesses, to assist the unemployed. That was pretty remarkable. So we're in a much better position now, 3 years later, than we thought we would be in. And the notion that inequality just must forever rise, as many of us people had begun to think, has been, disproved. And then we all of a sudden have a kind of a vista of technological possibilities that we hadn't seen. So we should be less fatalistic in saying, well, the future is whatever we can predict, and more appreciative of actually how much agency we have, right? I think the notion of the future is a prediction exercise neglects the fact that the future is a creation exercise, right? It's something that we're building. So recognizing our agency in this, and we've just demonstrated our agency in this in so many ways, we ought to take an active role in making these highly consequential choices about how labor markets will work, how we'll use these tools to invest in skills, and how we'll take this, bounty of possibilities and turn it into a set of outcomes that we want to, kind of inhabit and we want our children to inherit.
So, David, throughout history, pandemics have reshaped labor markets. Is what we see happening now a result of the pandemic, or would it have happened anyway?
It was happening, but it wouldn't have happened like this. So we were in a period of tightening labor markets that reflect a number of things. An important thing it reflects is demographics. We have a rapid increase in retirements, and we have very few young people entering the labor market. Their fertility is low, small cohorts, and then vastly restricted immigration. But then there really is a discontinuity with the pandemic, where all of a sudden things got much tighter, much faster, inequality really compressed, and we saw some pretty sharp changes in the way, especially low-paid labor markets among young workers, high school grads, or working. And I think many of us were extremely surprised by this. I know I was surprised. I'm on record as being surprised because I predicted exactly the opposite in a paper I wrote early in the pandemic called, the post-pandemic labor market, too few low-wage jobs. So I felt entitled to call my paper The Unexpected Compression, because clearly it was unexpected for me. So the tightness of the current labor market is good. It's making bad jobs or low-paid jobs less low-paid, but it's not transformative. Right? People are still, they're earning a little bit more. They're getting somewhat better benefits. Employers are doing a little more to accommodate them. But this is not going to rocket people into the middle class. And so we need to do more if we want that to happen.
So as the only immigrant in the group, let me raise a difficult question, because from all your descriptions, you are completely ignoring the viable immigration. I'm not a labor economist, but I don't think you need to be a labor economist to know that if you increase supply, prices tend to go down. We know that the United States has been very open to immigration, especially low-skill immigration, and prices of low-skill immigration have been very low. Surprise, surprise, around the time of the pandemic, where, number one, a lot of illegal immigrants were forced to go back because they couldn't survive in New York because they had no support, and after that, they were not allowed to come back, we see a massive increase in wages at the low end of the distribution. So everything fits one picture, which is immigration depresses wages at the low end. And if you want to ensure a more equitable distribution, you have to restrict immigration. Why am I wrong?
So I did actually mention immigration as one of the sources of the scarcity, the restrictions in immigrations, right? Now, this is a contested topic in labor economics because I think any trained economist shares your prior, right? That, of course, you restrict supply, price goes up. The evidence on this has been surprisingly hard to produce, right? Decades of research by David Autor and others has primarily found that immigrants are more complementary than competing with many native workers. But in my own opinion, many people, even people who believe the things I just said, will say exactly what you said. In fact, what I said a minute ago, which is restrictions on immigration are likely contributing to labor market tightness. And I think it's our immigration policies are inhumane and a mistake for the country. But that doesn't mean I think that if we have unrestricted immigration, we should allow wages to fall to any level they might fall to. I still support things that affect the quality of work for those who do it, including minimum wages, because they don't appear to be very adverse for employment. It's a very imperfect instrument and it's a very incomplete instrument. It's easy politically because it appears to be free, right? Like rent control. why don't we pass a law that makes prices better or wages better, right? And so it's always popular. Nominally, you don't have to raise your taxes to do it. But it turns out the minimum wage, despite not having a strong economic justification in the kind of blackboard version of the world, at least in many high-income countries, appears to work better than you'd expect. It appears to reduce inequality, to raise wages at the bottom, to reduce poverty a bit without having substantial adverse effects on employment. So I think it's inconsistent to say immigrants on the one hand have no effect on the market, on the market, and the other hand, restricted immigration supply is contributing to labor market tightness. I think that would be inconsistent. It is a contributor. I think we should have more immigrants, but I think labor market tightness is not our only tool for affecting the quality of jobs. We shouldn't have to actually go into an inflationary spiral to improve wages for low-paid workers.
Wait, why do you say we should have more immigrants? We should have more immigrants at the upper end of the income distribution, but not at the lower end, because that clearly affects the lower middle class.
I think we should allow many more immigrants for two reasons. One, it's incredibly welfare improving for them. There's no question that the ability to migrate to a high-income country massively improves people's standards of living. But again, I think that needs to be done, in conjunction with things that affect the quality of work. Many European countries have higher immigration rates than we do in the United States, and yet they don't have the same deterioration of labor standards in in-person service work. And that's because they make a choice about that.
So I don't want to come like as this big anti-immigration guy, but first of all, look at Japan. Japan had a very strong policy of anti-immigration, and they are increasing the quality of the jobs at the low end by a lot. Why? Because they use a lot more machine. So if in the United States you wash car by hands, it's because it's cheaper to do it by hand. A lot of jobs are done by hand because labor is so cheap. The moment you actually put pressure and create a sustained wage at the bottom, people find new way to actually save jobs and make job more productive, and most of the time also better and more pleasant. In instance, washing a car by hand ain't particularly pleasant to me. I think restricting entry is not so crazy, especially if you associate with the fact whose welfare you are maximizing. I think we are in a democracy, and in democracy, you should maximize the welfare of the people inside the country. That's what the democracy is about. And so you're saying that, this is great because maximize the people who are going to come here. But that's kind of a very, if you want, enlightened, but...
Sure. It's easy for me to say, right? It just, makes my life easier. More immigrants, cheaper services, right? Okay. I don't think Japan is a comparison that works in the favor of this argument. Japan has a desperate labor shortage. Their population is shrinking. They don't have enough workers to do what they need to do, and even elders are being under-cared for. And they are trying very hard and better than other countries to use technology to compensate. But I agree. People have a right to disagree. I can understand. It's not, we're not here to vote on the welfare of the world. Citizens have every right to, make decisions about who comes into their country. But I do think there are benefits to it economically, and it would address some of our problems about having a larger population to help care for the elderly, to help pay taxes. A shrinking population is a very difficult problem for an industrialized country. It'd be one thing if we just culled 10% of the population of all ages, but that's not what happens. When a population shrinks, it gets older, and that creates a very difficult imbalance. And that's what Japan is going through. Very few industrialized countries at this point have replacement rate fertility, right? Certainly Italy does not. All of Asia does not. The only countries in Europe that do are the Scandinavian countries, arguably because they have such favorable parental and childcare and educational situations that people don't find having children as costly or intimidating. Reasonable people can disagree about this. But I think at this point, our restrictions are too onerous, and I don't think we should believe that our only tool for improving the quality of low-paid jobs is labor supply restrictions. We could also improve jobs somewhat through minimum wages, through the earned income tax credit, through labor standards, right? We have done this before, and we don't have to. It's not either or.
Given the huge cost to our society of having an older workforce and not having a replacement rate, isn't it incredibly short-sighted of us not to enact more policies to encourage people to have children through better help from others and all the things that we resist doing, given that the long-term cost of that is so immensely high, per your point?
It is a puzzle that we don't fully understand about why, when countries get wealthier, fertility falls so much. I mean, I have my own theories, which is that children are an inferior good. And I have 3 kids of my own, and they're inferior. No, I have 3 kids of my own, and they're wonderful. But it is the case that adulthood has never been as good as it is, right? There are so many fun and interesting things to do, so much travel, so much experience, and you have good health for decades and decades. And so the opportunity cost of having children and encumbering yourself in that way, I think, rises. But pro-natalist policies have a pretty mixed track record, ironically. So many countries that have tried to do this, they've turned out to be expensive, they've had limited success, and they often, and this is a very politically incorrect thing to say, but they often encourage people to have children who were not the people they were intending. So we could do more, and I think it would be somewhat better. I think if we made higher education less expensive, if we made childcare less expensive, if we made work policies more family friendly, we would probably increase fertility a bit, and that might very well be worth it. But I don't think it's going to actually be sufficient. I actually think immigration, if we want to even maintain our current population over a longer period of time, immigration is going to be required. So I think if we just open the doors and don't worry about the labor market consequences, some of them will be adverse.
A lot of people, including your colleague Daron Acemoglu, talk about the future of technological unemployment. And in fact, they advocate some form of universal basic income to make up for that. You seem to be going in the opposite direction. What is the source of this disagreement?
He and I would probably agree on the following. The issue really isn't so much the quantity of jobs, but the quality of jobs. And I can't speak for Daron here, so I'll just speak for myself. I don't envision a future in which we're running out of work to do. All the time I've been talking about the robot apocalypse and the AI apocalypse and so on, labor markets have been getting tighter and tighter. Many European countries are seeing the lowest unemployment rate they've seen in decades. But there really is an issue of what type of work people are doing. And the quality of jobs in the United States has deteriorated over the last 4 decades for people without a college degree. You could think of middle skilled workers, people with high school degrees or some college graduates, doing kind of expert work in factories and production lines, in offices and administrative support and clerical and sales. And a lot of that work has been automated. And so those workers, it's not that they're necessarily unemployed, but many of them have moved into personal services, food service, cleaning, security, entertainment, recreation. There's nothing problematic about that work, but it pays poorly. And the reason it pays poorly is it doesn't require expertise. Think of a crossing guard and an air traffic controller. 2 people whose job it is to basically stop collisions between vehicles and people, or vehicles and vehicles occurring. Air traffic controllers make about 5 times what crossing guards do. Crossing guards are paid very little. They're doing the same work, but one requires specialized knowledge that's scarce. And technology, by the way, has made that knowledge valuable. An air traffic controller without like a GPS and a radar and a 2-way radio is basically a person in a field staring at the sky, right? So often expertise and technology go in hand, but not always. Technology can also eliminate the need for expertise. And that's what happened for many of these middle skill jobs. So what I'm concerned about looking forward is not a jobless future, but a future where a lot of expertise is potentially devalued and people are doing low value jobs. And we can have lots and lots of productivity growth coming from AI and other technologies. But if it doesn't accumulate to labor through the scarcity value of labor, then we have a real distribution problem on our hands. And I think that's something to be very concerned about. We're not good at handling redistribution through our political systems. If labor suddenly were not scarce because all of these activities could be done by machines, we would have fabulous wealth, but most people wouldn't have a claim on it. And then we would need another system for distributing that wealth. It frightens me to think what that system would look like.
Even the way you laid it out just now, it almost seems inevitable to me. And certainly jobs like home health care and all sorts of service jobs, the need for those jobs isn't going to go away. And yet, to your point, without some kind of intervention, nor are they going to pay more. And so why, or maybe a different way of asking this, why are these sort of utopian trends that we're seeing right now in the wake of the pandemic, where wages in this segment of the population are rising? How is there a way that could continue?
I mean, one thing is, low-wage jobs in the United States are worse than low-wage jobs in other high-income countries. And that's a policy choice. That's not intrinsic, right? So, every rich country has people working at McDonald's. The people in Norway earn twice what McDonald's workers do in America. They're flipping the same burgers. Now, you might say, okay, Scandinavia, it's paradise, not relevant. But even if you look to our neighbor to the north, the people at Tim Hortons are making 30% more an hour flipping burgers, right, in Canada. So So one thing is we've made choices about the quality of work and what distribution is going to look like. We could make better choices. But a second thing is most other countries also do a lot more to fill out that middle of work by creating skilled apprenticeship systems, skilled vocational training systems. We're going to need lots of people to do plumbing, electrical work, solar installations, right? There's going to be a lot of physical work and a lot of hands-on work in medicine as well. I do not think it's all going to be automated away. But those things, we actually lack good pathways into them. The United States education model is built around, kind of college or bust, right? We don't invest sufficiently in skilled vocational work, and there's no future where people without, education beyond high school, without education beyond post-secondary, have great career prospects. In some sense, if you're going to college, we have an 8-lane highway that goes from your high school to a college. If you're not going to college, then it's just like over the mountains and far away. You may find the way into the labor market. I do think there's a technological angle to this as well about how we use the technology, and there I think there's a lot of room for making good choices. All right, so I'm one of many people who thinks that AI really is a big deal, but how we use it, it's incredibly malleable, right? So, right, you could apply it to make people who are doing care work improve the set of care tasks that they could do, not just empathy, but also medicinal tasks, reduce the physical demands of that work. It's actually dangerous. A lot of people get injured lifting people, bathing people. You could use it to enable people with a set of some expertise to do a broader set of activities. Give a kind of concrete example. This is not as much technology as other institutions. The job of nurse practitioner. A nurse practitioner is a registered nurse with an additional master's degree. And a nurse practitioner works alongside a doctor and can examine patients, can diagnose, and can prescribe under the doctor's pen. NPs were basically not present 20 years ago. Now there are about 400,000 of them. They make about $150,000 a year at the median, which is a good income. And the employment of NPs is expected to grow 40% in the next 10 years, which is much faster than the rest of the labor force. But the main thing is this is a person who has less, they didn't spend, 3 years in medical school after college plus, 7 years in residency. It's a good example of taking expert work and allowing someone with less expertise, but sufficient training and support to do more of it, right? And we've gotten really good at making expert people really expensive, right? So over the last 40 years, we've kind of hollowed out the middle of the income distribution and the work distribution, and then made people who are doctors and lawyers and engineers and computer scientists, we've made them more and more scarce effectively, right? Their earnings have gone up enormously. It would be nice to have a world where actually some of that expertise was less expensive, but then people who were skilled in some foundational way could do a broader set of activities, right? You could imagine a future in which you would go for a 4-year degree in medicine. And then with this 4-year degree in medicine and a lot of technology tools, you could do a lot of medical care tasks, right? And the technology would be a support to that. And so it's possible that, it doesn't always eliminate expertise. It actually broadens its applicability, right? So just the way for example, I could go on YouTube this weekend and figure out, how do I, rewire and replumb my house, right? But if I don't really know how to do those things, I'm going to drown myself or electrocute myself, right? But if I actually know something, I know some basic skills, then having access to that information makes me much more effective. It's not a substitute, it's a complement, right? So the idea of using tools to make less expert people able to do more expert things would be a really, if we can pull it off, would be a very powerful use of this technology. But we're going to get pretty much what we aim for. Technologies are not going to appear if we're not trying to make them. And so it really matters where we put our money.
Is your belief in the value of work automatically antithetical to UBI, or is there a way to make the two work hand in hand? Is there a way to make the two congruent?
Yeah, it's not antithetical to that. We should recognize there's a bit of a continuum here, right? There's lots of things that we provide in kind, not in terms of cash, that in a sense you could think of as being universal basic income, right? So access to education, access to certain health services, access to even vaccination during the COVID pandemic. So there are many ways in which we are making transfers to all citizens that they have a right to, regardless of whether they're working or not. So UBI is another step in giving them cash on top of that. Done at a very large scale would be incredibly expensive. We would have to tax ourselves a lot to do it. That itself is challenging to pull off. And then the question I think one would want to ask is, well, if you're willing to tax yourself that much, is that how you'd want to use the money? Or would you want to use it for something else? I would like to see a lot more money spent in improving the quality of work, right? So if you ask me, do I want to give $1,000 a month to everybody, or do I want to give, $1,500 a month to boost wages in low paid employment? I might go for the latter. When I started studying economics, and I had the kind of temerity to say this, where we studied the utility functions, and there's increasing utility in consumption and declining utility in work. I always said, oh, they have it right, but the sign is wrong on the work part, because actually people benefit from work, right? It's not just income. It gives them structure, it gives them identity, it gives them social status, it gives them a circle of friends, a community. Work is valuable in many, many ways. And so losing work, even if you're, quote, compensated for it, is just not full compensation, right? It's sort of, I joke to my colleagues, I say, imagine you, Doron Acemoglu, you're an eminent economist, and we're going to end your job today, but don't worry, MIT will send a check to your home address, so you're good, right? Well, that's insane, right? Of course, that's not what that's not the entire value of Doron's job to him, right? He takes incredible joy in what he does, and pride in what he does. And that's true for most people. Most people do not want to receive a check as compensation for their crappy job, right? They want to have a job where they're proud of what they do and they feel good about being paid for it. So, my halfway house is, even if you think you know where you want to go and you want to integrate, don't do it as shock therapy. We just have seen over and over again how badly that works out.
You are very famous for your work on the so-called China shock, the devastating impact that the opening up to the WTO had on the American manufacturing and on the families that live in the Midwest. Last year, we had as a guest Glenn Hubbard, who was, as you probably remember, at the head of the economic advisors of the president when the China shock basically took place. And so we asked him if you knew then what you know now, what you would have done differently. And so let me ask the same question to you.
You can tell me what Glenn said.
I will later, but okay. I don't want to bias your answer.
So there's unquestionably the case that China's rapid growth, and especially after it joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, 2001, produced a flood of low-price goods with which American manufacturers could not compete. And that reduced employment in U.S. manufacturing by, depending on who you ask, between 1 and 2 million workers in a very short period of time. And you might say, well, that's a small number. It's a labor market of 150 million people. And that would be true, except that those are very concentrated losses, right? It's not, 1,000 people in every county, right? It's the furniture industry in, Tennessee or something. And so these were like, economic bombs that went off over certain communities, and people didn't recover from that very quickly. Even today, a lot of those areas are they're kind of blighted. And it was not anticipated that it would be this traumatic. I don't think the architects of this policy thought that this would be nearly as devastating to those places as it turned out to be. So if we were doing it different, if we were starting over again and we know what we knew now, I would say there are two things I would do differently. The less radical is I would put in place a lot more adjustment assistance to allow people to retrain, to move around and so on. But I think that's pretty inadequate. Those things don't tend to work out that well. I would have made it go much more slowly. And I think the rate of change matters enormously. It's not just where you're going, but how fast you go there, right? So we all know that, 25 years from now, there will not be the several million, commercial drivers and long haul truckers that we have in the United States. Autonomous vehicles will make those positions much rarer. That's okay, because that's a 25-year problem. And in 25 years, many people will retire from that activity, fewer people will enter. It's not going to be overnight. And so that's a manageable problem. But if it were going to happen today, that would really be a problem if come Monday morning, all those millions of people were out of work. The bottom line, in addition to the standard package of social supports, which I think are necessary but not sufficient, I would have slowed it down. If I knew I wouldn't, I don't think it would make sense or be feasible or in any way good to prevent China's development, but I would have slowed the rate of transition such that we could have made a much healthier movement of labor into other activities over a longer period of time.
Thank you for your time, David.
Okay, well, that was a lot of fun. Thank you guys very much.
As ESG investing rises in popularity, it is generating debate over its meaning and application among regulators, investors, and politicians. Arguments range from greenwashing to sacrificing profits over politics to unjust deployment of capital. A virtual three-part series, Unpacking ESG, co-hosted by the Rustandi Center and the Stiegler Center at Chicago Booth, in partnership with the Financial Times, engages global experts to explore the ways ESG could be a force for social and environmental impact. The first discussion happens on May 16th. ESG standards and disclosures, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Learn more at chicagobooth.edu/unpackingESG.
So what did you think was the most interesting takeaway, Luigi?
I think I have a lot of reactions, so maybe I have to do one at a time. The first is we have interviewed a lot of economists. I think that he is probably the one that comes across as most real. He's trying to also appear good, but I think he really cares about what he does. And this is where his credibility is much bigger, because it's not just an ivory tower economist, it's somebody who spent time with manufacturer workers and understands them directly. Is most people want more than just a salary, wants a job in the sense of something to be proud of, something that gives them context, that makes them happy, then makes them getting up in the morning. So I think that it's not just the money. Money is important. I will be the last one to underplay that, but it's not the only thing going on. And I think that this is where he has the credibility to assert that in a way that other people don't.
It's a part of the conversation that is often left out by people who think they have solutions to what's taking place. And that's, I think, a very human desire, a very human need to be of use. And I've always been astounded by how many thinkers are willing to disassociate from that and just assume that if you can give people money and enable them not to work, that somehow we'll be in this utopia. I think I mentioned on a previous podcast that I have a whole conspiracy theory surrounding UBI. I think it's being pushed by technology billionaires for a reason, because in an intention economy, they'd love nothing more than to have people who have nothing to do but sit at home and be on their devices and be funneling their attention into the technology economy. I think it's very Matrix-like. You could write a whole sci-fi book about this.
I actually like to buy into your conspiracy theory. You might be probably right. As an economist, I think that it's funny because now conspiracy theory has this negative connotation. But as an economist, we are trained to think about incentives, even when it comes to adoption of ideas or pushing of ideas. So to me, what you are describing is not a conspiracy theory, is pure sort of rationality. But that makes it for another day. What I want to stress the following fact. You remember that when we had Glenn Hubbard, I asked him twice the issue what he would have done had he known at the time what the China shock would have created. The first time he punted the question. The second time he said a little bit of retraining, but nothing much. So I do appreciate the fact that David, first time around, said very openly, we should have slowed down the process. I think that one thing that as economists, we don't pay enough attention are the adjustment costs. And the adjustment costs are basically our lives, because, the Industrial Revolution was great for humankind exposed, but left a lot of people poor and created a lot of disruption along the way. So if we can try to be more cognizant of that, I think it's very important. In that sense, he was very open and honest on that, even willing to go against the natural tendency of economists that free trade is good, and so the sooner you get something good, the better it is, and so on and so forth. So he was willing to sort of buck the trend there.
So the former math major in me very much likes the idea that the rate of change is as important as the change itself. But I did wonder about that a little bit, because being able to adapt if you slow down the pace of change seems very appealing and logical on the surface, that if we move more slowly, then you have more time to figure it out. But that presupposes a government and a society that has an interest in figuring it out. And so I worried that while it was an incredibly appealing answer, it was a little bit Pollyanna-ish in the end, that if you slow it down, we'll figure it out. But will we? Unfortunately, there's not much in the last 20 years of American life. Maybe I'm being too cynical, but that gives me the comfort that we would be able to figure it out, even given time.
No. I think that the way I interpret it is not so much that we will figure it out and done something differently, is that it's easier for people to adapt if you do it slowly. Then on top of that, you could do a lot of initiatives. But first of all, we don't know exactly what initiative besides retraining. But the reality is, in my view, is very simple, is if you are a 40 or 50 years old worker in a manufacturing plant and the plant closes, you're not going to reinvent yourself as a nurse or as a web designer the next day. Probably not even the next decade. And this is because you don't have a lot of flexibility and you're toward the end of your working life, really the opportunities are very limited. And so what you want is give the time of those guys to retire and make sure that not a lot of young people go in the same profession so that you have a transition, or at least the people that go in the same profession knows what they're getting into. They invest more in education to be more flexible down the line. But all this require time because we don't fully appreciate how long does it take for ideas and skills to get embedded in the population, because you need to train the teachers, and that takes a while. And then the teacher needs to train the next generation. And the next generation takes a little while to reach the labor market. So this stuff is incredibly slow.
What's interesting is that to me is that my brain went in a different direction, and I immediately thought what the government, what policymakers should do given time in order to ease the transition. Whereas I think he meant, and you are speaking to, a more organic form of transition, that if it moves more slowly, people will be able to figure it out for themselves. And that's interesting.
No, but you are right that this gives more time for the government to do anything. So I'm not denying that it's an important additional benefit. What I'm saying is that even if you think that additional benefit is going to be wasted, because these days we're not that optimistic about the government ability to do stuff, in spite of what David said, because David was actually very optimistic, said in COVID we did a lot of things right. So I think there is room for public policy, and sometimes we get it right. But even if public policy were not to work, I think that slowing it down a bit would be better. Now the issue, and he was very honest about this, is the issue is once you start slowing, there are a lot of forces that say, why don't you block it? So slowing but not blocking is really the difficult political economy question.
Perhaps a way to summarize his point of view on this is move slowly and don't break things, which is very anti our current modern Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and smash everything, right?
Absolutely. But also move. He's very clear that we don't want to stop, because some people say we want to stop change. It's too fast. We want to stop it. Say, no. You want to slow down. I wouldn't say move slow, but it's slow down. And honestly, I think that the change, maybe this reflects that I'm getting old, and when you're older, you see the world in sort of in the old days was different. But historically, change has taken place less rapidly than it is today. Actually, there is one favorite picture of mine is how long it took for different innovations to spread in the world. And so you start with electricity, that in order to get the first 50 million people to adopt, it took like 50 years, the phone similar. Then you go to the internet, and now you're down to 10 years. And then you go to Pokemon Go. And in 10 days, 50 million people were using Pokemon Go. So I think that that's an indication that really change does move. Now, Pokemon Go, of course, is not that important, but it is new apps. They go so fast, they spread so fast in a way that was unprecedented before.
If you're enjoying this podcast, there is another University of Chicago podcast network show to check out. It's called Carry the Two. Carry the Two is the show that reveals the mathematical gears that turn the world. Co-hosts Sadie Witkowski and Ian Martin bring unique perspectives from the fields of mathematics and statistics to convey how math shapes and reflects our reality. Each episode tackles a different topic. Subscribe to Carry the Two, part of the award-winning University of Chicago podcast network. Do you feel optimistic after our conversation with him that this dynamic of narrowing inequality that we saw is sustainable? Or do you question that? Do you think it might be a blip? I lean toward the latter, but I'd like to hear something optimistic on this gorgeous sunny Thursday.
Actually, let me take a middle-of-the-road view here, because basically it was really, really trying not to sort of endorse a view that immigration is bad. As an economist, we don't have good evidence of this. Yes, in first principle it should be there, but we don't know. Versus on trade, where he said, the reason is because people thought that trade was good, and so they didn't want to say trade was bad, and they didn't. So I said, wait a minute, aren't you doing exactly the same thing on immigration? So I think that, honestly, this is really at the heart of the tension for the, if you want, upper class Democrats or the democratic elite, because I'm very sympathetic to his heart when he says, we bring to another country somebody, we are giving him or her so much in value that is literally winning the lottery. And it's just when they put up for lottery, the green card, you literally win the lottery. Okay, so wouldn't you like to expand this gift to more people? And the answer is yes. If you care about the world, that's what you should do. However, this immigration, in my view, does have an effect on income distribution, especially at the lower end. I don't think it's a coincidence that the periods where you see a lot of catching up of the lower end of this income distribution are periods where immigration is more restricted. So between the 30s and the 80s, everybody celebrated the magic period after World War II, et cetera, but there was much less immigration than there is today. And surprise, surprise, all wages went up tremendously. If you have more people coming in, it's certainly more convenient for you, David, and I, because we buy those services, and if they're cheaper, it's good for us. But from the point of view of sharing the wealth produced is not working very well. And also, from the point of view of feeling we're part of the same group. This is, how can you say we belong to the same country? Then every time there's an opportunity, you take somebody from abroad and you had to compete at the lower end of the income distribution, but not so much at the upper end. For the doctors, there is not such a thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I think I can maybe explain the cognitive dissonance, which is that trade is people, but the effect on people's lives is second or third order, whereas immigration, the effect on people's lives is first order. So if you are a caring person, it's hard to see them both through the same lens. This does seem to be a bit of an untouchable thing in the economics profession, because remember our previous guest who wouldn't really answer that question, argued that over time, immigration was good, that it took longer for immigrants to achieve, but they didn't take jobs from Americans. And it will be interesting to see how the democratic elite part of the economics profession wrestles with the data from the pandemic. Even immigration aside, I don't know, maybe I'm too cynical. I'm just worried that it was this blip, and that now as we head into a much tougher economy as a result of the interest rate increases needed to blunt inflation, as well as the crisis in the banking sector, my attention is just gravitating toward the news of the layoffs. That seems to be a pretty constant flood. And it's, for a while the belief was it was just in the technology industry, and that you've had Disney and so many other companies since then. And I just when everybody is starting to embrace this, one of the themes that seems to me very clearly to emerge from the pandemic is how often the experts are wrong. I worry that just when we're starting to embrace this idea that inequality is narrowing, that it's going to flip around on us again.
Yeah, but I think that if you have some significant reduction in immigration longer term, I think that will change the structural balance and will make it more equal in terms of the income distribution. That's my prediction. But and then I think is the political decision. If we were to make my preferred immigration policy, that is, for 10 years, we only import graduate people, no people with no college degree, I think that the income distribution in this country will change dramatically and will benefit tremendously from technology, etc. So we have the cake and eat it too. Now, I understand that we're not helping people in Guatemala who are trying to run away from an evil government, which, by the way, we help create over time, but that's a different story. But I think that if you care about the income distribution, I think that that's the easiest solution. Now, whether this will be implemented, I think depends very much on the politics. But I don't see out of the question that a Trump 2 or a DeSantis president will do something like that.
It's a really interesting point, and a lot of people who want to both retain their belief that inequality is bad and they would do anything to narrow inequality and help low-wage earners in America, and that immigration throughout the spectrum is good, are going to have to wrestle with those dueling beliefs. And the question is whether people will, or whether the data will become one of those things that you just can't say, even if it does bear out.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center, in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Caesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, Chris Wheat, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for Capitalism wherever you get your podcasts.